How much do you know about bass amps, what they're used for, and why are you using it? If you're trying to buy a new amp or model an amp in a Helix or a Kemper or something else, first you need to know how they work. I'm Twistie, and in this video I'm going to take you through the simple secrets behind a bass amp, the insides of it, and how to pick the perfect one for your needs. Let's have a look. Bass amplifiers, or the bass amp, is a device that uses electrical power to make the lower pitched instruments like your bass guitar or a double bass loud enough to be heard by the performers, you, or your audience, the people coming to listen to you. Now, while a bass amp shares many features with the guitar amp, they are designed slightly differently. They're designed for the lower note frequencies, whereas guitars are aimed for the mids to the highs. And because of that, they have a little bit more tone shaping. Their tone shaping is different, and their ability to drive that lower signal is different. Bass amps came out of the necessity of the 1920s to 40s, whereas jazz clubs and blues bars started introducing brass or horn sections. So trumpet players and saxophone players becoming more prevalent in those types of bands made the volume louder on stage, and the double bass player just couldn't keep up. One of the interesting techniques that came out of that was the slapping of the bass strings to try and get some extra volume. But even that wasn't enough as venues started to get louder and louder. In 1933, the first purpose-built bass amplifier was built, an AudioVox Model 936. It was created to support an electric violin. And as far as I can tell, it was only available in the Chicago area. In the 50s, with the introduction of Fender's electric basses, Ampeg and Fender began releasing bass-focused amplifiers, with Ampeg's Super 800 and then the B15 Portaflex, still popular even in recording studios today. In the 1960s, with the growth of bands playing in festivals, those large venues brought with them the need for larger volume. Interestingly, the Fender Bassman, which was made to come out with the Fender P-Bass, because it was a 100-watt amp at the time, was often taken by guitarists to get their, what was at the time, 30 to 50 watt amps and make them louder on stage. In the 1960s, with the introduction of larger festival type venues, places like Woodstock needed a new type of amp to be created. With PA systems not being able to do much more than project the voice of the singer, if you've watched the video of the Beatles 8 days a week, you'll see that was all done through the tannoy system and sounded terrible. So festival going bands needed to have something bigger. With Woodstock, the acoustic 360 was invented because that became a massive loud backline which was able to be joined together to give the volume required for that festival. In the 70s, as venues progressively got bigger, so did the need for larger volume bass amps. John Entwistle of The Who famously started using twin stacks, where he was using 2 amps to get the volume doubled. And then he started looking at bi-amping, which is where you're sending the bass frequency to one cabinet or one amp and the highs and mids to another one, again to separate that and give much more volume and clarity as you're going through. Since the 2000s though, PA systems have improved to the point where bass players no longer need that big bass backline to hear themselves. With in-ear monitors and stage wedges providing the feedback to the performer or the bass player or anybody else on stage who wants to hear the bass, the volume on the stage is starting to become progressively lower and lower. If you look at Geddy Lee from Rush, he actually replaced his entire backline with a SansAmp pedal, albeit a rack-mounted version, and all he had on stage was a washing machine. At one point he had a popcorn maker and a roasted chicken rotisserie. So again, if it's okay for Geddy, it's okay for me. All that being said, what's the bass amp for? If it's not just the volume, what else is it doing for me? And why are there different versions that I need to consider? All right, so now let's look at what makes up that bass amp and what are the parts in there that are affecting the signal and why I would choose something over something else. I've rocked up on the stage, I've got all my parts, I've got my, my cab to sit on and place stuff on, I've got my, just joking, I've got my bass amp I've got my bass guitar, my trusty Attitude. I've got a tuner to make sure that I'm in tune, and I've got some effects that I like. Now, in my case, I'm using the HX Stomp, but you could be using any other multi-effects or a bunch of other pedals. So let's look at how this all comes together. So what am I going to need first? So firstly, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to connect my bass into the amp. So using my guitar lead, I go into a 1/4-inch jack, most likely, and I'm going into the preamp or the gain control section of the amplifier. Now what this is doing is it's taking the very quiet signal that's coming from the pickups and generated from the strings moving across the pickup, by the strings moving across the pickups, and I'm putting it into the amp, and the amp is then bringing that signal up to a level that can be manipulated or shaped on the way through the process. Now, this could be in two different ways. It could be a preamp that's based on valves or vacuum tubes, depending if you're American or English. And an example of that would be an Ampeg B15. Or it could be like my Mark bass amps, which are transistor or solid state. And so with a solid state or transistor, I've got a gain control, and that knob, basically I turn that knob until the clip light comes on and then roll back a little bit, and that gets me the optimal level of the signal to then process through the chain. Now on a valve amp, it's very similar. However, I'm now using valves, and valves are more warm than transistors, so they don't tend to clip, they tend to distort. So I can drive that gain a little bit with a valve, but again, it's the same idea. I'm not trying to drive that, I'm trying to get to a level which is able to be manipulated later on in the stages. So now I've got the signal to the level I need it to be, I'm going to start adding some tone control. So I'm adding a tone stack. Now this will be made up of a number of things. On a very simple bass amp, it's going to have the bass, the mids, the trebs. Now these may be frequency sweepable, or they may be set to a specific frequency by that amp manufacturer. You might find you've also got a parametric EQ, or you might also have some form of bright switch or ultra low switch, or another frequency predetermined thing that the amp manufacturer you're working with or are using has in to give additional tone control to shape that sound for you. Now what we can also do is, again, many modern amps have a tuner input. Now what this tuner input is it allows you to not interfere with the signal that's coming between the bass and the amp, and it taps off or siphons off a signal that the tuner will then take effectively at guitar level and allow you to tune. Now, often this is a on-off switch also, which means that as you engage the foot switch on the tuner, it will disengage the signal to getting into the tone stack. So that means that I'm muting the signal without doing anything on the amp itself. Additionally, many modern amps have a send and return effects loop. So commonly called an effects loop, sends, returns, etc. Now what this does is allows me to send, depending on the amp manufacturer, it'll be before the EQing or after the EQing, but fundamentally it's taking it from that tone stack and it's sending out to get additional external tone shaping. So in the case we've used before, the HX Stomp is now adding things like compressors, delays, distortions, whatever else I want to add to that. And it's then manipulating that tone and sending it back. Now on my Mark bass, that return comes after the tone stack. So the EQing on the amp happens and then it gets sent back. On a number of other amps, the send and return happens before you get to the EQ. What we're then doing is we're taking that shaped tone of the signal and we're then sending it to something that will make it then loud enough to be heard. So the power stage or the output driver of the amp, it's designed to take that line level signal and make it voluminous. So you'll see here I've shown that by making it a big thick cable. So speaker cables are different to guitar lead cables because they're holding a lot more voltage or sound going through them. Now again, this could be a solid state transistor amp, or it could be a valve amp. In the case of the B15s and the Fender Bassmans, their power stage is a valve. Now, when I turn the master volume up, then that will drive that amp stage or the power stage to increase its volume. Now with a valve, that will get a warm, distorted sound as it starts to go over. With a transistor or a solid state amp like my Mark Bass or the power stage on the Ampeg SVT 4 Pro and the Gallien-Kruger GKs, they may have a valve preamp, but the power is coming from a solid transistor amp. That's what allows them to get lighter weight and increased volume. So those 1,000 watt amps are unlikely to be valve based amps. Now they will drive and get volume, but it will remain clear. They often come with a pre-clip, so you can't drive them to a distorted phase. Whereas on the valves, again, you're pushing the valve to just warmly distort over there. A number of amps have a balanced output. Now that balanced output you'll see either on the front or the back of the amp, depending on the manufacturer, or it might even be on the side. But in the case of my Mark Bass, it's on the back and it looks like an XLR microphone connector. Now it's designed so that I can send a balanced signal. So remember, I've got effectively a line signal coming through, and I need to balance that out so it's more like a microphone signal. And I'm going to send that out to the front of house. I'm going to send it to a powered stage monitor. I'm going to send it to a mixing desk for recording. Now there's often two different mechanisms for sending that out. The first one is pre-EQ. So I'm taking the signal before I do any tone shaping to it, and I'm sending that signal out, and I'm sending that out to let's say that's the mixing desk. So I could use that to replace the need for a DI pedal. The alternative to that is I can go post EQ. So I can do all of my tone shaping the same as I was doing for the power stage and to send out through the cabinet. But now I'm shaping it and I'm sending that to the front of house. So when I build it all together, this is what it looks like. I have my bass going into the input. I'm setting the level so it's manipulable. I'm tapping off a bit from my tuner so that I can make sure I'm in tune and I can mute the amp without having to touch the amp from my pedal. Then I'm shaping the tone of that. I'm sending some of it out to an effects processor, and then I'm returning that back in, and then I'm sending it, in my case, I'm sending it to the cabinet here, or I could also be sending a second one out to the front of house via the XLR. So this is a good way of avoiding having to use a stage DI box. So rather than them giving you a DI box and you plugging it up the front near your bass, you just stick it in the back of your amp, set it to pre-EQ or post-EQ, and let them deal with it at the front of house, and you're still listening to your cab. Now, as an alternative to that, because I'm using the HX Stomp, I'm effectively replacing this input preamp and the tone stack with my HX Stomp. So if I have a B15 configuration and some delay and some chorus and some distortion, etc. on my HX Stomp, then I'm effectively replacing what's on this bass amp, and I'm only then, through the return signal, leveraging the power stage to get that signal out to the speaker. So I'm effectively bypassing all of the front stuff. The tuner is in the Stomp, the preamp functions are in the Stomp, the tone controls and the EQing and all that's in the Stomp. I'm now just literally leveraging either the power stage to turn that into something that I can hear, or
I'm also able to use the XLR out. So again, because the HX Stomp doesn't have a balanced out, rather than having an unbalanced signal going to the front of house and having to use another DI box, then I can use my amp instead. That gives me the best of both worlds. I've got the signal going to the front of house as I intended it from the Stomp as a balanced signal, but I'm also getting the stage presence through my cabinet.
Choosing the right amp and cab is crucial for you getting the sound that you want for the style of music you're playing and for the environment you're playing in. When you choose an amp and cabinet combination in the physical world, it's not only the tonal aspects of the valve versus solid state, but how much tone control you have. You need to consider how much power you need. What's the wattage? Do I need a 1,000 watt amp to get to the back of a stage? Or do I just need a 15 to 20 watt amp for my bedroom? Or am I miking it or am I DIing it, which means there only has to be enough power so I can hear it on stage. So for example, my 500 watt mark-based bass amp, the F500, when I stick 2 cabinets on that, it gets to 500 watts. I can't use that in my house. So one of the advantages of using a modeling device like the Helix or a Quad Cortex or a Fender Tone Master or something, is that you can select and configure the most complex tone and leave the volume to the front of house. So I can pick the B15 amp that I want because I like that tonal quality that it gives me. And I can worry about the volume and the projection to the audience and my ears to somebody else. If you're struggling to work out how to get the best tone out of your amp model or your physical amp, sign up for the newsletter, the link's below, and then you can grab my free copy of a 5-phase method of tuning in your tone on your amp. Also, if you haven't seen it, check this one out.